Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG. And today on Game Master's Guide, we're going to be doing a little bit of soapboxing, if you will. I'm going to be getting up on my soapbox and talking about the very subject that is one of the lies we tell as game masters. Now, of course, we are talking about a game based on fiction, so everything that we tell fundamentally is a lie when you come down to it because it is a fiction. But in this case, we're talking about the information that we provide to our players that is perhaps guidance, or perhaps it is simply to make our lives easier. So let's get into it. But before we do that, make sure you go down below and press all the buttons so the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. And let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, we are going to talk about the very concept. It happens in games groups constantly. The adventuring group is trundling down a hallway and they come to a Y intersection and they have a choice of going to the left or to the right. And the intent, of course, is to examine the entire space and determine what's a value inside and to gather that information as quickly as possible. And the first thing that comes up is somebody says, let's go left. Somebody else says, let's go right. And now you've got a group that's divided in their concept. And they really are considering breaking into two groups. Now, the trope of role-play games, the mechanism of role-play over 50 years has always been to adhere to a concept of not splitting the party. And today we're going to examine that from the standpoint of each solid argument for staying together. But I'm going to also provide you with some alternative ideas on why you might want to consider splitting up the party in order to achieve certain goals. And in doing so, I think I'm going to give you perhaps a different way of thinking about role-play experience in particular and what it is that we're doing. Before we go into that, I do want to mention that the concept of role-playing itself by dynamic is actually one of the first levers, and we'll go into the particulars here in a moment. But realize that if you are thinking in terms of playing pieces on a game, if you have your pieces all in one space, it makes it easier for you to move from space to space if you're moving the coherency. If you've got a model representing the group and then you split, now you don't. And so therefore, even on a most rudimentary basis, it seems logical. But let's get into all the different pieces of the argument, shall we? So the obvious point is that if you split the party, you will have fewer eyes, fewer hands involved in each of the separate pieces that move forward into the story. There are, in today's modern world, there's a lot of concern over the action economy. If you have 6 players, that's 6 actions. If you only have 2 players, that's only 2 actions. And therefore, from a sheer action economy standpoint, it's a danger to reduce your number and therefore move into smaller groups. Now, this wasn't so much the case in the past. It wasn't a consideration because that wasn't really the emphasis. The concept of action economy wasn't even actually considered. It was more a matter of whether or not you had the physical armament and the numbers would justify the risk. We're not going to go into that particular, but just realize that there is an argument to be made that you simply have fewer eyes and hands on scene when something goes down than you would if you had the entire group. The, of course, resolution to this is that that's true, but you also have a smaller footprint. You're not taking up as much space, and even the possibility of failures is reduced because you have fewer die rolls to make, therefore potentially just as many successes as failures are possible. And therefore it's not necessarily an argument that holds up on its own, but it does make sense that you are considering how many bodies you have in the scene. Now, of course, mathematically this would be the case in any case, and of course this is perhaps cluttered a bit when you talk about where you are doing this split. If it is a narrow corridor, fewer is probably better because you're able to react and adapt differently than you would if you had a large group in the same small confined space. So take that with you will, but the argument therefore is that you simply just don't have the same number of bodies on scene as you would have otherwise. The most common argument, of course, is that when you have divided time, you've got doubled time, and therefore, argumentatively, if you had 3 and 4 groups, you would be tripling or quadrupling the amount of time it would take to resolve the same amount of encounters. Now, there's a bit of a fallacy because you still would be getting the same encounters in. It's just that you now have additional problematics as each group then has to describe to the others what they have encountered and engaged with, and therefore you've just increased the amount of time that the players have to merge all of that data into one coherent story. And this argument is, of course, from the standpoint of a player in a game wherein the storyteller says, well, when you go on these separate parts, only the players that are in that part can interact. Therefore, they fundamentally ask the other players to leave the room or move to another location or, suspend their actions there at the table. And thereby, you're reducing the amount of time that each player has to play. Argumentatively, if you split 3 ways, you are basically reducing a player's playtime by 1/3 because the other 2/3 are in groups that are doing things without them. And this is a major problem because, we only have a limited amount of hours of play. If we split up every time we jump into a game session and we go 3 different directions, then we're actually only getting to play 1/3 of that, and that's really not kind of fair. So it's a major issue in terms of that. So this therefore leads the players to the conclusion that they should stay together. Of course, the third is that the very concept of playing as a part of a group instead of working as a whole is counterproductive to play dynamics in a role-play game. You are playing together in the game session for the accompany of each other, and therefore you're actually harming the game mechanics themselves and causing the scenarios to be imbalanced. Now, I'll be honest, this one is probably the weakest of the arguments because the storyteller still has the power to adjust the individual encounters to match with the number of people that are in the room. But this is historically not been done. It isn't that way. Normally, if a GM has written out the adventure, has an idea of what's in each room, and when the players engage with a monster that was scaled to fight against 6 players and they come in with only 2, they are numerically just at a greater disadvantage, and therefore it's you're messing with the scaling and therefore making it more problematic for your personas to live through the situation. And I believe this may actually be the primary source for the argument of not splitting the party, is because the adventure is still engaged to the 6, and now you're only meeting them with, say, 2 players instead, and therefore you're setting yourself up for problems. Now, here, I'm going to stay on this last screen for quite a bit because the idea here is that what we don't seem to realize is that the very idea of coherence in a role-play game is a meta state. By that I mean the game mechanics for a role-playing game, if it's based on the role-play aspect, the dynamic interpersonal reaction, it's unrealistic for the whole of the party to be in every scene. In other words, if player A is going to, say, have a tete-a-tete and meets with a young lady, the entire group isn't going with him. Even if she's going to be a principal source of information for the next scene, he's simply going to be the only one interacting with her, and so the split of the party is a given. And the idea of the coherency of the group is only a structure built by the players in order to try to keep the balance of play to the group instead of to the individual. But even in cases where this is not specifically stated, quite often the game master will de facto put the players into the isolated format simply by limiting who can be involved. The idea of only those people who are able to detect invisibility should respond to this next dice roll, or only the players with a strength above this can withstand the power of the wind, or whatever. And these limits placed by the game master are in effect isolating the players every bit as much as their personal decision to move with this small group over to room A while the rest stays in room B. So the only real mechanical difference is that the game master is in abject control in the case of requiring a certain attribute or stat or skill, whereas in the case of the players, the player agency has allowed them to split. And historically, those individuals who were gifted with the moniker of railroaders were very well hammered for this mechanic of saying that everybody should stay together. And I've even heard people argue that the players that must stay together in a group are really being railroaded by their game master because he's saying what they can or can't do. And I've just come to a different understanding with 50 years behind the screen, as it were. All this time as a game master, I've come to the realization that player agency is pretty important to a role-play environment. If you are playing a role-playing game and you are utilizing the assets and tools of the mechanism to afford you the ability to do role-play things, in other words, discussions, dialogues, and such, then splitting the party is actually advantageous. Now, I go one step further. At my table, and I recommend this for everybody, but most players haven't yet embraced it. If you have a group of, say, 4 to 6 to 10 players, and a pair of them want to split off, they may do so, but you actually allow the other players to remain at the table and listening in on the conversations and such. And while this may seem unfair because they didn't take that advantage of going with the smaller group, nonetheless, the players that are not in the space, that are not part of the engagement, cannot actively engage, but can certainly passively record notes, names, locations, things that are brought up in the conversation, not for themselves per se, but actually acting as the awareness, observation, and memory of the player who is in the scene. And this is done on multiple levels. This is wise. The first of which, of course, is that no one person is going to remember everything that happens in an encounter. And for the purpose of sharing that information back with the adventuring group, allowing them to hear the actual activity, they may choose to take notes on it and have therefore their own understanding of what happened resolved. And particularly when you're sending, an adventuring group into a village and you're wanting to gather wool on what's going on in the community, having 4 or 5 different people asking different people different questions and allowing the group to hear the answers really allows for a deeper awareness of the players. Now, is that a meta condition? Certainly. I'm not denying that I'm providing the players with more information than they should have had available. But if the games group's argument is we are playing this to play together, then it makes sense that each person's interpretation of what happened in the scene can be recorded separately, only so that they can act as the collective consciousness of the individual, so that when he is describing what happened back to them, we don't actually have to have him go through a word-by-word description. Instead, he can simply convey that he just had the conversation that they just heard and that he wants to talk about it, and then the players can all put in their 2 cents about what happened in that conversation. Not necessarily in the actual dialogue portion, but instead of the actual play mechanics dynamic of it, that they're actually getting of one mind on what happened in that conversation. And when you're doing this with 3 or 4 groups, this actually fixes the time argument that we talked about earlier. The arguably multiplied time that it takes to handle the groups is actually mitigated when the sharing of that information comes down to just reciting that you heard what I just heard, or you were there for that conversation. Therefore, everybody can gather the information more quickly, and therefore your resources that were provided across 3 groups now are known by everybody simply by a little bit of hand wavium that they have shared that information with the others in the group. All in all, what this really is saying is that the purpose of role-playing, the purpose for carrying this dynamic forward, has to do with why we are role-playing in the first place. The concept of breaking the group up and making them move to different locales and then have to play the game of telephone to recite what happened is, in the eyes of some game masters, an optimal way to mess with the players, because it's up to them to track their own lore. But at the same time, it is damaging to the storyline overall if one or more of the players is a novice or didn't quite comprehend what the conversation was about and therefore doesn't know what to translate back to the group. So you really have to look at it in both directions. Which of them do you want? Do you want a adventuring group that can get through a multiplicity of scenes in a relatively short period of time, especially if it's dialogue based? Now, when you're talking about taking this to a combat situation, of course, that would be a difference dynamically. But depending on how close they are in proximity, it may not be really so different than, say, the classic ambush situation. If you think about an encounter from the standpoint of player isolation, the only ones who would be aware and able to respond to the, if you will, surprise round of an ambush would be those that had some special skill that would put them in isolation from the rest, and therefore they would be able to interact before the rest got there, so to speak, before the rest were aware. And that's really no different than a advanced group leading out and being in front and therefore engaging with the enemy a turn or so before. So it's really not a breaking of the meta state of a group to allow the players to pick up on things by having, your scouts leave for a second or so in advance. But in a larger sense, the splitting of the party doesn't damage the story at all. If anything, it's going to enhance it by letting players have a larger understanding of what was being conveyed by their associates when they do return. I know I've talked in circles there. Ironically, this episode ended up being considerably shorter than the first version with no sound, so apparently I talk faster when I'm talking than when I'm just looking like I'm making sounds. So anyway, I want to thank you for being here and being a part of this show, and we will see you in the next episode. Do remember that we record Monday through Friday at ostensibly at 10 a.m. and 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time, Monday through Friday, and we will see you all in the next episode.